Hi everyone, welcome back to AP Environmental Science. In today's video, we are going to cover topics 5.5 to 5.6. So let's go ahead and get started. So from our previous lessons, you have learned a little bit about how we are clearing land, why we are clearing land. So we've learned about deforestation methods. We've learned that the main reason why we are doing deforestation, especially in South America, is to create space for agriculture. So we are going to talk about the different agricultural methods. We've briefly touched upon some in class, but at home you'll learn more about the sustainable methods as well as different ways that we water our crops. So these are a few ways that we plant our crops to prevent things such as soil erosion and soil degradation. So soil erosion is the loss of topsoil over time due to wind and weather. And we should know that roots of plants and trees create these really stable soil systems, preventing soil from being washed away by wind or by water or by weather. Now, they will provide this stable system, and when we cut down the trees, we're removing that stable root system, so we're going to have increased instances of erosion and worsening erosion. So in order to prevent that, instead, we will do these different types of agricultural practices. So one of them is contour plowing. For those of you that are familiar with makeup, think about face contour when you're doing makeup. So if you look at this picture here, it's like literally carving out these lines or contours. They are parallel to allow natural slopes of the land instead of steep slopes. So this is going to prevent water from being run off or washed away, and it will prevent soil erosion. Terracing is when you instead cut these flat platforms of soil into a steep slope, which is going to catch water and prevent the soil from running off with the water. Perennial crops are crops that live year round and are harvested multiple times, so you're not destroying the root system when you harvest the crop. So these crops are planted and they produce fruit year round, so you don't have to pull up the root system. Windbreaks are when you use trees or other plants to prevent the wind from eroding the topsoil. And this can be useful because once you're done, you can cut down the trees and then use that for firewood or fruit, timber, and it also becomes a habitat for pollinators and other species to help with pollinating your crops. Tilling is when you're breaking up that topsoil, and it does impact the soil stability and structure over time. So rather than tilling the soil, you can do a no-till, which is leaving the leftover crop remains in the soil instead of removing them. And this is going to add natural nutrients and moisture back into the soil. Strip cropping is another name for intercropping. This is alternating rows of dense crops with rows of less dense crops to prevent runoff from eroding soil. Okay, crop rotation is something that was brought up when we did city farming. So in city farming, in year 2, you couldn't plant the same crops that you planted in year 1. Instead, you had to switch them out and grow something different. So this is going to help make sure that the nutrients that are being removed is not always at the same intensity. So there are certain crops like corn that need a lot of nitrogen to grow. And if you keep planting those crops without allowing the nitrogen to replenish naturally through the nitrogen cycle, your nitrogen is going to be depleted in the soil, resulting in a poor yield. So rather than plant the same crop every single year, you'll switch them out with crops that aren't as demanding or crops that help promote nitrogen being added into the soil, like legumes. Green manure is when we're using a animal byproduct for our crops. So this would be leftover plant matter from a cover crop, which is a crop that's planted in the off season between harvest and replanting of a main crop. And I kind of just want to pause here for a second because within our school, this is kind of hard for us to conceptualize and understand because we are a part of an urban district. And this is just topics that we are naturally not as familiar with because we live in a city. Whereas if you're a student that lives out in the country, this is something that you will be more familiar with. So if you're feeling overwhelmed by this, it's okay. This is stuff that you have probably never learned about in your entire life, and you've never had to because we live in a city and we are not exposed to things like this. And there are other things, of course, that we will be exposed to, like pollution and flooding of our cities, that someone who lives in a rural area does not experience, right? Everything is all relative to our own experiences, which are shaped by where we live. So just keep that in mind. Using limestone is going to release calcium carbonate, which neutralizes acidic soil. Acidic soil has naturally high hydrogen ions, which displaces nutrients from soil, which we'll talk about later when we get to soil acidity and acidification. So let's move on to irrigation. Irrigation is the different types of ways that we water our crops. If you guys remember anything from history, civilization really started 10,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent of Mesopotamia, and it's when we discovered irrigation and that we can water our own crops rather than being hunters and gatherers. So furrow irrigation is very similar to like the irrigation, in Minecraft. This is when you dig a hole along crops and fill it up with water. Okay, very similar to what is done in Minecraft. This is easy and inexpensive. Water will seep into the soil slowly. It is pretty efficient, with 66% of the water being retained and 33% being lost to runoff and evaporation. And runoff, again, that word keeps coming up, but runoff is when water is naturally going to flow from one place to another. It will bring soil and nutrients with it as it's going to flow to another area. Flood irrigation is exactly what it sounds like. You're going to flood an entire field. Not all crops can be grown in flood irrigation. It just depends. Rice is the most common example of a crop that needs to be grown in a flood system called a rice field. Drip irrigation is exactly what it sounds like. It's when you're running a hose with small holes in them that will slowly drip out water over time. This is going to prevent water. Okay, I'm sorry that there's a random cut here. The Google system I'm using crashed again, so I'm hoping I can edit these two together. Ooh, I feel like a YouTuber. Okay, anyway, spray, I don't know where I was at. I'm moving on to spray irrigation. Spray irrigation is exactly what it sounds like. It's like when you're using some kind of hose with a spray nozzle to spray the ground directly. This is more efficient because you're using less water, but it is expensive. It's going to require pumps and sprinklers and the movement of those sprinklers. So in certain types of irrigation, especially furrow and flood, the water can become logged, which means overwatering is going to cause this saturation of the soil. So this is what we saw when we did our soil series lab. Remember, we have 3 different particles of soil: sand, silt, and clay. Sand has the biggest particle, meaning it has the biggest pore, meaning that it's going to absorb water very quickly. Silt is the medium one, and clay has the smallest pore and the smallest particle, meaning it absorbs water very slowly. Waterlogging is when you're filling all of the pore space within a soil. So once you have all of the pore space filled, you're going to start flooding the surface. So we can see that here in the unsaturated versus the saturated soil. This is very common in furrow and flood irrigation, and some crops prefer to be grown in that system, but some do not. And this is a problem because when you have the pores completely filled with water, oxygen cannot get in and the roots cannot absorb it. Some plants, this is like a misconception addressed in biology. Some plants absorb oxygen through the root. Some plants absorb oxygen through the leaves. It just depends on the type of plant. So to prevent this, we could do drip irrigation or soil aeration, which is poking holes or cores in the soil to allow air in and water to drain through. This was our lab that we started and finished, and we will do a lab report on this. This is the soil salinization process, which is when salt builds up in the soil over time. So all water and I shouldn't say all water, but water isn't just pure water. It can contain trace minerals and salts. And when water gets too hot, it evaporates. We know this, but it will leave behind the salt. So, groundwater for irrigation naturally has small amounts of salt. As the water evaporates, the salt is left behind and it can slowly build up until it's toxic, dehydrating the plant roots and preventing growth. And we looked at in our lab the optimal levels of a salt concentration for plant germination to occur. So, in order to prevent or reduce the impacts of soil salinization, we should be using drip irrigation, soil aeration, flushing soil with fresh water, or switching to a fresh water source that doesn't have trace amounts of salt. Now, this is just talking about global human water usage, and water is just such a commonly overlooked thing that we just don't realize that we are overusing in our daily life. And I think one of the things that we all can do in here is make a conscious effort to use less water. And that can be as simple as making sure the faucet is off when you're brushing your teeth. When you wash your hands, turn the water off while you're using the soap. If you're going to wash your hair and you don't need the shower on, you should try and do that. Those are small things that really do make a big difference. And I need to update this slide because we have yet to talk about the massive usage that AI has on water consumption. If you know anything about computers, they run very hot. And normally computers have built-in fans to cool them off. Well, these mega computers that are running these AI plants so you guys can chat GPT everything, they are using so much water. It is now detrimental to neighborhoods that live close to them in terms of what water they have available to them. We have never used water at such an alarming rate. It is used for cooling in power plants and electrical plants. In manufacturing, it's used to make metals and plastics. In our household, you use water for everything, for cooking, for cleaning, for bathing, for watering your plants, for giving water to your animals, and for livestock and agriculture. Everything on life needs water. It is the miracle compound that has allowed life to flourish. And it's the key sign that we look for when we look at other planets, if life is possible or was possible or could be possible, is we look for water. And we are using so much of it, so we can use AI. So we can create oil to destroy our planet. Sometimes it's so backwards, but that is the reality. Okay. In our next video, we'll talk about pest control methods and other stuff. Bye.